today about some work in progress, mainly related to sensory-motor interaction in robots, and also a project on throwing we have together with the Department of Psychology. So, but let me start with the robotics part. So, my research is in cognitive robotics, and we're mainly doing projects which are somehow one or the other way related to interaction. So we're doing interaction with the environment by spatial navigation with these flying copters. We're doing interaction with each other in swarm robotics experiments. We're doing sensory-motor interaction where we create body schemes, body models, and we do robot-robot and human-robot interaction as well. And so, well, usually this is in the acknowledgements, but here you can see already now all the people that are in my group and helping and assisting in one way or the other: PhD students, student assistants, and collaborators. And most of them have been involved in the research I'm presenting today. And well, as the main one of the philosophies we're following, and which has probably already presented here and the days before, is the embodiment hypothesis, which basically says that intelligence emerges from the interaction of an agent with its environment and as a result of sensory-motor activity. So, of course, both with its environment and with others. And yeah, one example here is throwing, and saying that learning how to throw is much more complicated than, for example, learning to play chess in a way for a machine, also to transfer this to machines. So we're looking at interaction, and we're focusing, well, as I said, on interaction with the environment and with others. And what is very important here is for us is the dynamics and that we have a closed loop, like from actions and perception. And another thing is that we think that sensory-motor interaction, or the skills for sensory-motor interaction, are really a prerequisite for more high-level things like social interaction. For example, reaching or grasping is a prerequisite for some kind of joint attention with each other. And of course, that's very useful for having intuitive interaction between each other. I'd like to show like some sort of interesting example here, a quote by Louis Walpott about coevolution of body and brain, and to see what is the relationship between the body and the interaction with the environment and having a brain. And he said, why do plants not have brains? And the answer is actually quite simple. They don't have to move. So you only have a brain because you have to move, you have to interact with the environment, you have to find back to your home position, you have to find partners to mate, and so on. And another example which goes exactly along that line, maybe you've seen this animal before. These are sea squirts, and it's also about interaction, movement, and the brain. And these animals, they swim around in the sea, and at some point in their life, they decide to not to move anymore, so they attach to a rock, and the first thing they do, they digest their brains. So they don't have to move anymore, they get rid of their brains. It's a nice source of
faculty after 10.
Exactly, you've seen a TED Talk then of Daniel. So what I'd like to present today are well, some current quests we're investigating in. One is sensory-motor coordination, and we use human throwing as an example for complex tool use. So of course there are many sorts of tool use as well. You see this crow here trying to using sticks to dig out insects. But we want to start with some more simple thing, tool use by throwing objects. I'd like to look then at some prerequisites for imitation and look at the method of internal simulation for predicting motor actions. So let's start with the first project on complex tool use and aimed throwing. And this is a cooperation with Verena from the Department of Psychology at Humboldt University Berlin. And I'll show that in a second, but you can also read up the references if you like. So we built an experimental setup with this, which is a mixture of the real world and virtual reality, where we study humans throwing objects and in a controlled environment. And so why is this interesting? Why do we want to study throwing? There are several reasons for that. So well, tool use could also be temporarily extend the body map. So that's quite interesting. If you imagine you're driving your car, and when you're driving your car, well, at least if you like to drive a car, then the car becomes part of your body image. So you can feel whether you fit into a parking lot or you can't, and so basically the steering wheel and sometimes the whole car becomes part of your body map. Another example, well, and throwing is a complex goal-directed action, and some people even say, Calvin, for example, that throwing might be a forerunner of speech. So it's used for, because throwing requires complex coordinated muscle movements, it might be a forerunner of speech. And if you look at the history of throwing, it's a very complex skill, and it can be improved until the age of 40, which is very unusual because most motor skills they peak at around the age of 20, and then you're declining. But throwing you can still get better until the age of 40, approximately. And what is also interesting in the particular case of throwing is that there's a critical time window for the release. So if you're throwing an object and you release it 100 milliseconds too late, then you completely miss your target. And the experiment we set up, I'd like to call them some kind of embodied EEG experiments, because we had these subjects and they had to throw an object, which is actually a Nintendo Wii remote control. And we measured the EEG data while they were throwing. And it wasn't sure at the beginning whether this is possible, because for most experiments our partners did before, the most movement was maybe moving a finger during the measurement. And we actually wanted to do the recording while the people are physically throwing an object towards a target. And how did it go? So they were throwing this object, this Wiimote, and releasing it. So we could measure that they were just releasing the button, so we could measure that. We had a Bluetooth connection with the Wiimote. There were accelerometers and gyroscopes inside. So we could calculate, as soon as they released the object, we could calculate the trajectory that the object would make and transfer it to a virtual representation of a ball in this virtual reality setup here. So we have on the right, you see the screen they were seeing. And we had the virtual target there, which we could modify. We could make it smaller or bigger. We could move it to the side. We could do all sorts of things with that. We could also change the physics, like introduce wind from one or the other side, to do some very controlled experiments here, but still having the real motor interaction of the subjects. And that was the control monitor, so you saw how the trajectories of the throws were looking like. And then the experiment setup that we did, that were done by Romy Frömer and Annika Dix. So first you had this remote adjustment, and then at time 0 you had the first stimulus, which was one of 4 different conditions. I will explain them in a second. And then you had, as soon as you saw this, you had 2 seconds to prepare to the signal when you were allowed to throw. The signal consisted in the task changing from yellow to green. At that point, you had to throw the remote within 800 milliseconds, otherwise the throw was discarded. And after 200 milliseconds, the screen went blank in order to make the subjects really throw the objects away. And when the object hit the target, you got an acoustic response, either of hit or fail, miss or fail, and some sort of feedback. And so all the participants, they were trained with some with training data until they reached a certain hitting criterion, and then they were allowed to the tests. So the 4 conditions were an easy target, which was quite big, a difficult target, which was much smaller, Knopf, which means button, which was just releasing the button from the object, just opening your hand a bit, and Wurf, which means throw, just throwing the remote no matter whether you hit or not, just throwing it.
Did you test the temporal precision of this? I would assume, I mean, we haven't worked with the Wii specifically, but other similar things, that it's rather sluggish. And this can be a bit problematic because it can introduce a jitter in the calculation of the people models. So did you test this? How
yes.
reliable this was and how the delays are in this?
The signals we got back from the acceleration sensors, for example, we got them back with 100 Hertz, but really in constant 100 Hertz distances. So we managed to, we also had some problems before, but we managed to really get the 100 Hertz in, constantly. And so the event-related potential components of interest were mainly the CNV, contingent negative variation, and they were the main time window of interest here. So these were the first results we got. Is basically 200 milliseconds before the people were allowed to throw. And so you see here that the different conditions were ordered in the right, well, in the expected order. So the button throw, easy and difficult. So you see a variety between these different conditions here. So they were clearly visible. And
S1, S2?
That was S1 was when the task was shown, and S2 when the signal was to throwing.
So either would move all the
was shown, or one of the targets was shown at S1, and
S2?
At S2 it turned from yellow to green, and the persons were allowed to throw, start throwing.
You must have a pointer there.
Yeah, it's there.
Yes, so here are the differences. I have another image where maybe you can see it more easily here. That's the left was the central midline and the right the frontal midline. And so you also see the order of the different conditions here, that there's a clear difference. And we of course we corrected for eye movements. So because when you're throwing, well, you fixate your eyes towards the target, but by doing that, you move your eyes when you're preparing for the throw. And yeah, so these are the first results we got here, and they are quite promising because they're basically saying that you can actually detect a difference in motor preparation for these different tasks with different difficulties. And so next thing would be to introduce different conditions to have moving targets. What is also interesting to have a stop condition to see until what point you can still stop the action, and basically, well, here the goals are summarized. What we would like to do now is to create a computational model of human throwing, and we already have the simulation and the virtual reality setup, so we can now combine our other simulations with the setup and use the same sensory input and use the same task, obviously. This accounts for learning data and individual differences. So we would like to find out what makes a good thrower, what are the features during learning. Maybe you have different strategies. Maybe good throwers have a different strategy in preparing for this task or learning this task than not so good throwers. So we have several hypotheses here, but we'd like to find this out here with these tests. And of course, we can now use also the same similar setup to study other closed-loop sensory-motor interaction tasks. And as a future goal here, of course, our group would like to build a robotic thrower that passes a sensory-motor Turing test, so that the robot really throws like a human, and you can't find a difference between the robot throwing or a human throwing. So that was the first part about the throwing experiment, and I would like to go on now with some experiments we did concerning imitation behavior and development of body maps. And well, you see here that, well, at least for very young apes, it's possible to have even some interspecies imitation behavior. And if you want to have imitation, there are two prerequisites. First, you have to recognize the actions of the others or of another person or agent. And second, you have to relate them to your own body. So you have to have some kind of representation of your own body, like a body schema, body map. And in robotics, we also do similar experiments than in psychology. So for example, we start with these mirror experiments with our humanoid robot now here. I won't go into detail, but the robot is standing in front of a mirror, performing some actions, and at the same time seeing the consequences of what it perceives by performing these actions. And some years ago, we did some work on body maps at Sony together with Frédéric Kaplan. And these experiments were done on these eyeball robots, and the whole, what we put into the algorithm, the whole algorithm was that informationally close sensors are also close on the map. So the robot performed some sort of behavior, and at the same time all the sensor data was measured. And from this sensor data we measured the distances, and they were projected onto this map, which is, well, the two axes here, they just span a 2D virtual space, which could be a robot cortical map. And close sensors, informationally close sensors, are then close in the map. So you can see here the head, the hips, and the shoulders of the robot, which kind of fit to the, well, both the sensor morphology and, of course, the current behavior of the robot. And as a method, we used a an information distance method, which consisted of the conditional entropies of the two sensor streams of the sensor streams of a pair of sensors. And the advantage here is that it has, you could use also different things like different measures like mutual information, but the advantage is here that you have metric properties for that, and then of course you can use it to create a map. And well, what was interesting for us, that these maps, they not only represent the body morphology, so they're not just some representation of the position where the sensors are attached to the robot's body, but they also represented the current behavior of the robot and also the interaction with the specific environment. So if the robot was walking on, doing some walking behavior, you could see a difference in the map whether it was walking on carpet or on a wooden floor, because you have different properties, and this makes a change in your sensory information, and of course then this makes a change in your body map. So also the interaction with the specific environment is included here. But it is now only implicitly included, and we wanted to include more strongly the motor commands. So we started some experiments on motor babbling, and we studied the random movement strategies. So this is some work together with Guido Schilacci. And we have the robot from Aldebaran here performing random movements with the head and the arm. And for simplicity, we attached a marker on the hand, which is a AR tag. So you can easily detect the position of the marker from the robot's camera. And the robot performed these random movement strategies or some kind of motor or body babbling in order to learn the connection between the action and what it perceived. And all this research is done in the context of a European projects where we have several partners, and the PhD students involved here are Guido Schilacci and Sasha Bodiroja, and you can find more information on the intro website here. And we're mainly, the Berlin part is mainly focusing on intention understanding and gesture production in these interactive robotics experiments. And so for the algorithms you could use now several methods to predict. Once you have, through this body babbling, you have learned the mapping between your actions and your perception, you can now, of course, do a prediction about what happens if you see a target here and you have to reach it. So you can have predict the next sensory signal, which would be a forward model, or the necessary motor signal, which would be the an inverse model. And one method which could be used, which we use several methods here, would just a simple prototype-based mapping, which is based on k nearest neighbors. So you have given a query, which are the coordinates of the markers, which are these red points here in 3D space. We can take the average and then map it onto the 6D action space here, and compute a prediction of the actual joint configuration of the robot for moving the arm to a certain position. And one nice question we have asked in that context was whether pointing could emerge from grasping. And this arose when we asked what happens if the object is outside the field of reach. So we can predict all the positions we were able to reach so far, or the robot was able to reach so far. But what happens if the desired target is outside the trained or the babbled space? And obviously, it was very simple to find out, and looking at our algorithm and looking at the experiments, and but it was interesting to transfer that to the idea whether how pointing emerges in human development, and it's not quite sure whether this is done by imitation, imitating others of pointing, or whether this arises just from trying to grasp something which is out of reach, and then actually this results in a pointing gesture that might be reinforced then by some social interaction. And okay, for this one we used 3D information about the position of the hand, assuming that there's depth perception, which starts around the age of 5 months in human infants. And as you might have guessed, then the resulting behavior, if the object is outside the field of grasp or field of reach, then the robot is actually pointing towards that, because if you consider this sphere, this is the closest position to the other one. Going further from this motor babbling experiments, we look at simulation theory, and there's a nice quote by Basalou here, that simulation is the reenactment of perceptual, motor, and introspective states acquired during experience with the world, the body, and the mind. And we can simulate, of course, we can simulate these actions by using internal models. I'm sure these have popped up in previous days already, or sounds familiar somehow, maybe? No. There are these internal models, which in this case consist of an inverse model, which is the controller, which predicts from sensory state at time t and sensory state at time t+1 the next motor movement to get from one to the other state. And the forward model, which has as an input a motor command and a sensor command, and predicts the next sensory input at the next time step, which is then the predictor. And in our experiments, both the inverse model and the forward model, they were trained by body babbling. So these models are actually learned in our experiments by using the data from the body babbling. And as methods, so far we used the k-nearest neighbors or some multi-layer perceptrons for the predictions, but you can actually, it's not very important what kind of models you use to get the idea. There are also many other possibilities to train these models here. And as has already been mentioned as well, that these kinds of internal models are often also called like that and used for human motor control. There are some quite early papers by Daniel Walpott and colleagues. And it has also been shown already that forwards models can be learned. For example, Dearden used Bayesian networks to train these models, so that's also possible. And there's also long-term prediction by combining several of these inverse forward model pairs. So you can here go over time and always predict the next step of your action in order to have a long-term prediction of some trajectory of your arm, for example. And yeah, so these can be combined in that way. I'd like now to come back to the tool use example and show some experiments we did concerning, together with Bruno Lara here, with tool use and internal models. And it concerned, what we tested here was a reaching movement of the humanoid robot now, just with the standard standard arm, and with a tool which is extending its one arm. So the robot can choose to either touch or reach something just with the arm, or use this tool to reach some position in space. And well, that actually looked like this. So again, we use these markers. This time, after learning, after training, they have been put on the object. And as I mentioned before, the training has been done with this kind of body babbling, where this tag was put on the end effector, which was either the hand or the tool. And so for each arm, or for the arm, there has been, the internal model has been trained during body babbling, and also for the arm with the tool, a second different model has been trained through experiencing with the extended arm. And by doing that now, we could present an object to the robot, and the robot could decide whether it's more convenient or easier or possible at all to reach this object just with the arm, or to reach it with the tool. You can see it here. So there's been one internal model without the tool, and one internal model with the tool. And by looking at the desired sensory input, we could compare what was the predicted sensory output of each model, and then compare which would better fit to the actual shown position in space. Is that clear? We did some additional experiments about action recognition, which maybe is kind of similar to the experiments Giovanni presented yesterday. So we did some action recognition experiment, where we observed a human grasping an object, putting the object somewhere else, and releasing the object. And the robot had some trained internal methods for each action here. So you can see we just used several features, like the distance between the hand and the object, the orientation, and the speed. And the models were trained for each of the actions. So we had the 3 actions: approach, displace, and withdraw. And each of the actions was represented by an internal model. So of course, well, the next step, of course, would be to not have these 3 fixed actions, but actually learn different actions, learn more actions, cluster the space into actions. But that preliminary experiment started with these 3 fixed actions, and so we had one internal model for the approach action, one internal model for the displace action, and one internal model for the withdraw action, which have been learned by this data. And then for a given action, we showed to the robot a video of a human performing several actions in a continuous action stream. And for each of these actions, we could predict which one was most likely that actually was going on currently. So the robot could detect what action the human performed, and then as a next step, potentially use it for imitation behavior and so on.
Sorry?
Yes?
So in terms of classification of these movements, would you see any improvement compared to a vector machine, or vector machine, or whatever standard machine learning classification? In comparison to the algorithms we used? Yeah. So does it actually help to have this inverse forward model with an internal model of the action, or does it not?
Of course, it's well, this is a conceptual thing, And we trained it with, for example, here we used a multi-layer perceptron to learn the mapping. But of course, there could be other methods like using support vector machines to learn the similar mapping, and maybe that would better scale with more data and so on, or use less memory, or some methods might be more biologically plausible. But yeah, you can.
How good can you classify the different? What's the percentage of correct classification?
We had with these three actions we had about 95%. Or Guido, do you remember? Around 90% for correct classification with three actions here. So for this experiment, it's quite good, but of course it really depends on how well the particular actions were performed in this video stream. So it's a difficult measure to say. That's why we had 90% correct classification. And okay, in order for you to not get too hungry, I come to the summary now. So it's more, well, it's not really only conclusions here, but it's also some claims, and I'm claiming that interactive systems are ideal for the study of intelligence. So both in humans, I argue that you have to make more experiments where the people are really interacting physically with the world in order to study learning and intelligence. And that simulation theory and internal models are useful abstraction to study this development of intelligence here, and to study the sensory motor loop interactions. And also as a third thing, that in the future tool use and body schemes and all these experiments I just showed, they need to be considered together in order to, because they're closely related, so you can't consider them just separately. And also, well, it's a strong claim, but sensory motor interaction is really a prerequisite for cognition. So thank you very much, and I also like to thank my students and collaborators here, Annika Dix, Romy Firmer, Werner Sommer, Bruno Lara, Guido Schilacci, and Sasha Boliroja. Thank you.
Actually, I want to start with one. So it wasn't really clear to me in
you want to ask the question?
Yeah, that's okay. So it wasn't really clear to me in the EEG study how you actually want to specifically look at the correlates of tool use. I mean, the CNV, or maybe it's a readiness potential, is, I think, rather unspecific. It just signals that you're preparing for something or you're going for something. But do you have any ideas on how you want to go specifically for the aspect of goal-directed action and tool use? And what would you be hoping to find in the EEG signal?
Yeah,
probably not very trivial.
At the moment in these throwing experiments, we were looking at motor preparation and looking at different difficulties of tasks, and at what point these preparations actually start, and how much has to be coded somehow internally in front, and whether maybe just some action sequences are sent to the hand. So we're hoping to get some insight into these questions, and I think then it's very much related to tool use concerning the internal models.
Yeah, try again. The CNV has different parts. It moves from prefrontal cortex and finally the generators immediately before action onset are moving towards motor systems. So did you do source localization?
I'm not an expert in that. That was a part of the psychologists.
Right, but addressing it in a theory-driven manner, there might be a prediction on that something is going on in motor systems, or rather not in motor systems and in prefrontal cortex. And well, you